Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain falls softly, and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. At night, California was supposed to sleep behind locked doors and drawn curtains. But for years, someone moved quietly through its neighborhoods, as if the homes belonged to him. He did not break glass. He did not rush. He entered with patience, preparation, and a terrifying sense of control. Long before police understood who they were hunting, before they even knew what to call him, families across the state learned the same lesson. The most dangerous threat was already inside. The first attacks did not announce themselves as part of something larger. They appeared isolated, confusing, easy to misread. A prowler here, a burglary there, a shaken victim unable to fully explain what had happened in the dark. In the beginning, law enforcement treated these cases as local problems, not pieces of a single unfolding nightmare. In quiet suburban streets, residents began noticing small, unsettling signs. Open gates that had been closed, windows unlatched, items moved but not stolen, dog repellent sprayed along fences. Sometimes footprints appeared beneath bedroom windows, then vanished by morning. These details rarely made headlines, but they accumulated in police reports, scattered across counties that did not yet know they were connected. Then the assaults began. Victims described being awakened by a flashlight in their eyes. A masked man stood at the foot of the bed, his voice low and controlled. He carried a gun at first, later a knife. He ordered compliance with calm precision, threatening to kill if anyone screamed. In homes with couples, he forced the man face down, bound with dishes stacked on his back. If the plates rattled, he said, he would kill them both. This was not impulsive violence. It was deliberate, rehearsed. In the early cases, police struggled to get clear descriptions. The attacker struck in darkness, he whispered. He fled quickly. Victims were traumatized and often blamed themselves for details they could not recall. Investigators attempted composite sketches, but they varied too widely to inspire confidence. Some officers believed the perpetrator was young. Others believed he was older and experienced. Nothing about him settled easily. What did begin to stand out was the pattern of preparation. The attacker clearly scouted neighborhoods in advance. He learned schedules. He knew which homes had dogs, which had weapons, which had escape routes. He disabled outdoor lights. He used nearby drainage canals, bike paths, and fields to disappear. In some cases, he returned to the same area multiple times, watching, waiting, adjusting. Phone calls followed some attacks, heavy breathing, threats, taunts. A voice reminding victims that he had not forgotten them and could come back at any time. For the people who received those calls, the terror did not end when the police left. It lingered in every creak of the house, every passing headlight, every unanswered ring of the phone. As reports increased, detectives began to realize something unsettling. These crimes were not random. They were linked by method, by behavior, by a signature that suggested a single offender growing more confident with each attack. But jurisdictional boundaries slowed everything. California's law enforcement agencies operated largely independently. Different counties used different reporting systems. Evidence sharing was limited. Patterns that seemed obvious in hindsight were obscured by distance and bureaucracy. A rape series in one county was not immediately compared to a burglary series in another. Each department believed it was facing its own offender. Meanwhile, the attacker adapted. When patrols increased, he shifted locations. When residents armed themselves, he struck differently. When police warned the public, he seemed to listen. He learned from every response, every press conference, every failed attempt to catch him. This was not just a criminal reacting to pressure. It was someone studying the system meant to stop him. In some neighborhoods, fear became routine. People installed locks on windows that had never been locked before. Men slept lightly, listening for sounds. Women stopped opening curtains after dark. Children were taught what to do if they heard footsteps at night. Safety became a constant calculation rather than a given. Investigators debated what kind of person they were dealing with. The offender showed planning and patience, but also cruelty. He exerted control not just through violence, but through fear. He stole small personal items, not for value, but as trophies. He lingered in homes after assaults, eating food, rearranging objects, reinforcing his dominance. The psychological impact was enormous. Victims struggled with shame and guilt, even though they had done nothing wrong. Communities questioned their own security. Police officers felt the pressure of every unsolved case, every promise made to victims that justice would come. But the leads went cold as quickly as they appeared. Then something changed. The violence escalated. The attacker began targeting couples more frequently. The threats grew more explicit. The risk to victims increased. Investigators realized they were no longer just dealing with a serial rapist or a prowler. The trajectory suggested something darker, something moving toward lethal force. Still, no one knew his name. No one knew his face. He remained a shadow, slipping between jurisdictions, evolving faster than the systems designed to stop him. Each attack deepened the sense that this was not a spree that would burn out. It was a campaign. And somewhere, in the spaces between patrol routes and county lines, the man responsible was watching it all unfold, learning what worked, learning what did not, preparing for what came next. By the time law enforcement began to understand the scale of what they were facing, the damage was already profound. Dozens of lives altered. Entire communities reshaped by fear. And a predator who had proven, again and again, that he could enter a home without being seen and leave without a trace. What investigators did not yet realize was that this was only the beginning. The pattern they were chasing would not stay confined to one type of crime or one part of California. It would spread. It would change. And it would leave behind a trail far more devastating than anyone initially imagined. By the time investigators accepted that the attacks were connected, the offender had already evolved beyond the profile they were chasing. What began as a series of prowling burglaries and sexual assaults was becoming something more dangerous. The man behind them was adapting, refining his methods, and expanding his territory. Detectives in Northern California started comparing notes. They noticed how the attacker moved through suburban neighborhoods with military-like discipline. He entered through sliding doors and rear windows. He used shoelaces and cords from the homes to bind victims. He brought pre-cut ligatures. He controlled scenes with minimal noise. These were not the actions of someone improvising. They suggested training, or at least long practice. In Sacramento County, the attacks intensified. Couples were targeted more often. The attacker's voice grew colder, more assured. He whispered threats about killing children in nearby rooms if parents did not comply. He spent long periods inside homes, sometimes hours, leaving victims bound long after he had gone. In several cases, he returned to the same houses weeks later, as if to remind them that escape was an illusion. Law enforcement began referring to him by a name that reflected his primary hunting ground, the East Area Rapist. Task forces were formed. Patrols increased. Community meetings filled with frightened residents demanding answers. Officers advised people to lock doors, trim hedges, install alarms, travel in pairs. Some neighborhoods organized armed watches, men patrolling streets at night with rifles and radios. The atmosphere was tense, volatile, and exhausting. Still, the attacker continued. He seemed to know when patrols changed shifts. He struck just outside saturation zones. He vanished into drainage canals and bike trails that few officers knew as well as he did. In one instance, a police officer nearly caught him after a pursuit through backyards, but the suspect escaped into darkness, leaving behind nothing but a sense of how close they had come. Evidence was collected: shoe impressions, fibers, semen samples. But forensic technology at the time was limited. DNA could not yet identify a suspect. It could only confirm that the same person was responsible for multiple crimes. And that confirmation, while chilling, did not bring them closer to a name. The psychological toll on victims deepened. Survivors lived with constant fear, knowing their attacker had studied them, learned their routines, and could return at any time. Some moved away. Others fortified their homes into fortresses. Sleep became fragmented. Relationships strained under the weight of trauma and guilt. Then, abruptly, the attacks in Northern California slowed. At first, investigators believed their strategies were working. Increased patrols, media attention, public vigilance. But relief was short-lived. New reports began emerging hundreds of miles away, in Southern California. Different counties, different detectives, familiar details. A masked intruder, a flashlight, binding ligatures, threats whispered in the dark, couples targeted. Plates stacked on a man's back. The realization was devastating. The same offender had relocated, or at least expanded his hunting grounds. He was no longer just the East Area rapist. He was something broader, something mobile. And in the transition, the violence escalated again. In Southern California, the attacks grew deadlier. Homes that once would have been scenes of assault became scenes of homicide. Victims were found bludgeoned or shot. In several cases, women were sexually assaulted and then killed. Men were murdered where they lay, unable to defend themselves. The careful control that once defined the attacks was still present, but now it was paired with finality. Investigators struggled to reconcile the shift. Was this the same offender or a copycat? The methods were consistent. The behavior was familiar. And the forensic evidence confirmed the truth they feared. The man who had terrorized Northern California had not stopped. He had crossed a line. Now he was killing. The crimes in the South were initially treated as isolated murders. Different jurisdictions, different names given by different departments. But slowly, through shared evidence and painstaking comparison, the connection became undeniable. A single predator had evolved across regions, adapting his violence while maintaining his signature control. The stakes changed overnight. What had once been a race to stop assaults became a race to prevent the next murder. Task forces expanded. Federal agencies became involved. Investigators pored over timelines, trying to identify how the offender moved, where he might live, what kind of job allowed him to travel and disappear without notice. They built profiles. He was likely white, likely physically fit, likely knowledgeable about police procedures, possibly connected to law enforcement or the military. He attacked with confidence, in the presence of armed victims. He anticipated response times. He vanished without leaving witnesses. But profiles do not make arrests. Leads flooded in. Thousands of tips. Suspicious neighbors. Former boyfriends. Men with criminal records. Men without them. Each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. Each false hope weighed heavily on the investigators and families who needed answers. Years passed. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No capture. No confession. No body count announced. Just silence. The kind that suggests not resolution, but withdrawal. For law enforcement, the silence was almost worse than the attacks. It meant the offender was still alive, still free, still capable. The case files grew thicker. The evidence aged. Retirements came and went. And the man responsible slipped further into the past, hidden by time. But the crimes were not forgotten. For a small group of investigators, survivors, and analysts, the patterns remained vivid. The unanswered questions lingered. Who was he? How had he evaded capture for so long? And why had he stopped? What they did not yet know was that the answer would not come from traditional detective work alone. It would come decades later, through a method no one in the 1970s could have imagined. And when it came, it would finally put a name to the shadow that had haunted California for a generation. For years, the case existed in a kind of suspended state, not solved, not inactive, but waiting. The files were thick with reports, photographs, lab results, and handwritten notes from detectives who had long since retired. Evidence sat in storage. Memories faded. Witnesses aged. And yet, the crimes refused to disappear. Survivors carried them forward. Many victims never stopped thinking about the man who had entered their homes. They remembered his voice, his movements, the way he seemed to enjoy control more than speed. Some followed news obsessively, hoping for an arrest that never came. Others avoided coverage entirely, unable to reopen wounds that never fully healed. Among investigators, a few refused to let the case die. They revisited old assumptions. They re-examined timelines. They questioned whether early conclusions had been too narrow. The offender had been described as organized, methodical, almost disciplined. But he had also taken risks. He had lingered. He had taunted police. He had escalated. These contradictions suggested complexity, not a simple profile. One of the most significant breakthroughs came not from new evidence, but from connection. As law enforcement agencies slowly improved information sharing, analysts began laying the crimes side by side, the burglaries, the rapes, the murders. What once appeared as separate chapters now read as a single narrative. The offender had not transformed randomly. He had progressed. When the risk of capture increased in one area, he moved. When control no longer satisfied him, he killed. The pattern was no longer just geographic, it was behavioral. The offender selected victims who fit a narrow range. Suburban homes, middle-class neighborhoods, easy access to escape routes. He avoided apartments and densely populated areas. He struck when he believed he could dominate the environment completely. Every choice reduced unpredictability. Investigators also noted something else. The crime stopped not because the offender was caught, but because something in his life had changed. Possibilities were debated endlessly. Marriage, children, employment, injury, relocation, incarceration for an unrelated offense. None could be confirmed, but the absence of further crimes did not suggest remorse. It suggested interruption. Then, technology began to catch up. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science advanced dramatically. DNA analysis became more precise. Old evidence could be retested. Biological samples, once considered limited, suddenly held immense potential. The offender's DNA profile was confirmed across multiple crime scenes, linking rapes and murders definitively. But the profile still had no name. Law enforcement uploaded the DNA to national databases. They waited for a hit. Year after year, nothing came back. The offender had never been arrested for a qualifying crime. If he had lived quietly, avoided trouble, and blended into society, the system had nothing to match him to. The case reached a frustrating plateau. Then a new idea began circulating quietly, among a handful of investigators and civilian analysts. What if the offender could be identified not through criminal databases, but through family? At first, the concept sounded radical. Investigators had used DNA to exclude suspects and confirm guilt for years, but tracing a suspect through relatives was largely uncharted territory. Still, the logic was sound. DNA did not exist in isolation. It was shared, passed down, connected across generations. If the offender himself was not in a database, perhaps a distant cousin was. This approach required careful legal and ethical consideration. It also required patience. Analysts would need to build family trees from partial genetic matches, then narrow them down through records, geography, age, and opportunity. It was not a shortcut. It was a slow, meticulous process. Work began quietly. Genealogists examined public DNA databases used by people researching ancestry. They looked for individuals whose genetic markers partially matched the offender's profile. When a potential relative was identified, they traced that person's family line backward and outward. Birth records, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, old addresses. Names began to accumulate, hundreds of them. Most were eliminated quickly. Too young, too old, lived in the wrong state, no access to California at the relevant times. But slowly, the list narrowed. A small cluster of men emerged who fit the age range, the geography, and the timeline. One figure stood out. He had lived in areas near the early crimes. Later, he had lived near the murder scenes. His age matched witness estimates. His movements aligned with the gaps in the attacks. Nothing about him screamed criminal, which, in a way, made him more compelling. Investigators did not rush. They knew how devastating a mistake could be. They watched quietly. They verified records. They looked for corroboration, not coincidence. They examined his employment history, his residences, his connections. Everything lined up too cleanly to ignore. But DNA would be the final word. Law enforcement needed a sample that could be legally obtained without alerting him. Something discarded. Something innocuous. A piece of trash. An item touched and thrown away. They waited for the right moment, knowing that decades of patience had brought them to this point. The man went about his life unaware. Shopping. Running errands. Blending into the routines of suburban normalcy. No one watching him saw a monster. They saw a neighbor, a stranger, nothing more. Behind the scenes, investigators prepared. If the DNA matched, it would close one of the most complex serial crime investigations in American history. It would connect decades of terror to a single individual. And it would finally answer the question that had haunted victims and detectives alike. Who had been inside those homes? The moment was coming. The confirmation did not come with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, in a laboratory, through a comparison of genetic markers that either aligned or did not. There was no ambiguity, no margin for interpretation. The DNA matched. Decades of violence, spread across California, resolved into a single conclusion. The man investigators had been watching was the source of the profile taken from rape kits and murder scenes going back to the 1970s. The prowler, the rapist, the killer. He was no longer a theory or a nickname. He was a person, standing in real time, unaware that his anonymity had just collapsed. Law enforcement moved quickly, but carefully. They knew the suspect was older now, but they also knew his history. This was a man who had planned meticulously, who had anticipated resistance, who had used weapons and threats to control situations. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no chance for escape, Surveillance teams followed him for days, confirming routines and ensuring public safety. When the moment came, officers approached him outside his home. They did not announce the case name. They did not explain the scope. They placed him under arrest and transported him without incident. When questioned, he reportedly showed confusion, then irritation. He asked about charges. He denied understanding. But the evidence no longer relied on statements or confessions. It was embedded in his biology. It connected him to scenes he had believed were lost to time. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. For years, investigators had speculated that the offender might have a background in law enforcement or military service. That speculation proved correct. DeAngelo had once been a police officer. He had worn a badge. He had sworn to protect the public. While communities slept, he had exploited his knowledge of patrol patterns, response times, and investigative limitations. The irony was devastating. As detectives assembled the full case, the timeline finally made sense. His residences aligned with the geographic shifts in the crimes. His age matched early witness descriptions. His abrupt job loss and life changes coincided with changes in offending behavior. What had once looked like coincidence now appeared as continuity. Most chilling was how ordinary his life had seemed. He lived quietly. He blended in. He was not caught because he stopped being dangerous. He was caught because science advanced to the point where time no longer protected him. The same patience he once used to stalk neighborhoods had been matched by investigators willing to wait decades for a single breakthrough. When the charges were announced, the scope was staggering. Multiple counts of murder, dozens of counts related to sexual assault and burglary. Crimes that spanned counties, cities, and years. For survivors, the news was both validating and overwhelming. The man who had haunted them without a face finally had one. In custody, the control he once exerted vanished. There were no whispered threats, no ability to dictate silence, no darkness to hide behind. The system he had evaded for so long now surrounded him completely. Every movement was monitored, every word documented. The careful planner had run out of variables. For investigators, the arrest marked the end of a pursuit that had outlived careers and reshaped investigative methods. For victims, it marked something quieter and more personal. The confirmation that what happened to them was real, connected, and no longer unanswered. The Golden State Killer was not caught in the act. He was not exposed by a witness who recognized him in the street. He was uncovered by the accumulation of truth, by evidence preserved, by patterns remembered, by a refusal to let the case fade into history. In the end, the shadow that had moved through California homes was revealed not by chance, but by persistence. And for the first time since those nights of terror began, the doors could close, knowing that the man who once slipped through them no longer could. Now, let's begin story number 2. In the early hours of a quiet night in Durham, North Carolina, a staircase became a crime scene. Not a dark alley, not a remote road. A staircase inside a large, comfortable home where danger was never supposed to exist. At the bottom of the stairs, Kathleen Peterson lay in a pool of blood. Her husband, novelist Michael Peterson, would later say it was an accident. He claimed she had fallen after drinking wine, that he found her still breathing, that he tried to help. By the time first responders arrived, Kathleen was dead. The walls, floor, and steps were smeared with blood in a way that defied easy explanation. From the moment police stepped inside the house, nothing about the scene felt simple. Kathleen had deep lacerations on her scalp. There was blood cast high up on the walls. Large amounts of it. More than many officers expected from a fall. Yet there were no skull fractures, no obvious defensive wounds. The injury sat in a strange middle ground. Violent, but ambiguous. Michael Peterson was calm, almost too calm. He told investigators that the couple had spent the evening by the pool. Wine, conversation, a normal night. Kathleen had gone inside first. He said he stayed outside, then later found her at the bottom of the staircase. He claimed she was alive when he discovered her. He called 911. Then he called again. His story never changed in its broad outline. But investigators quickly noticed something else. The house felt staged around comfort and intellect. Books everywhere. Art. Evidence of a carefully curated life. And Michael Peterson himself was not just a grieving husband. He was a man with a complicated past. As police began processing the scene, they learned that Michael Peterson had once been a journalist, a novelist, a public figure of sorts. He had lived abroad, he had served in the military, he had written about violence and death. And years earlier, in Germany, a woman close to him had died in circumstances that were disturbingly similar. That detail did not stay quiet for long. Elizabeth Ratliff had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1985. At the time, her death was ruled a cerebral hemorrhage. No charges, no trial. But now, decades later, the similarity was impossible to ignore. 2 women, 2 staircases, 2 deaths, 1 man present for both. Investigators did not jump to conclusions, but suspicion took hold quickly. The blood evidence became the focal point. Analysts documented spatter patterns on the walls and stairwell, drops, smears, cast-off. Some experts believed it suggested repeated blows. Others argued it could still be consistent with a fall. The science was not settled, but the volume of blood demanded explanation. Meanwhile, Michael Peterson's behavior drew attention. Friends described him as intelligent, charming, and emotionally complex. Critics would later describe him as manipulative. He spoke openly to police. He cooperated. But he also appeared controlled, even performative. For detectives trained to read grief, something felt off. Then another layer emerged. Investigators discovered that Michael Peterson had been living a double life. He had engaged in secret relationships with men, something Kathleen reportedly did not know. The prosecution would later argue this was a motive, that Kathleen had discovered the truth, that a confrontation had occurred, that the fall was not an accident, but the aftermath of violence. Michael Peterson denied it completely. As the case moved forward, the staircase itself became a symbol of uncertainty. Every step was measured, every angle photographed. Experts recreated the fall again and again, trying to determine whether gravity alone could explain the injuries. The public watched closely. This was not a straightforward murder case. There was no weapon, no eyewitness, no clear confession. What existed instead was a body, a husband, a staircase, and 2 possible explanations that could not coexist. Either Kathleen Peterson fell and died in a tragic accident, or she was killed by the person who called for help. As prosecutors prepared their case, they made a critical decision. They would bring Elizabeth Ratliff's death back into the light. They would argue that this was not coincidence, but pattern. That staircases were not unlucky settings, but chosen ones. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that grief looked different on different people, that blood could be misleading, that investigators had built a narrative around suspicion rather than proof. By the time the case reached trial, the question was no longer just what happened at the bottom of the stairs. It was whether truth could be determined when science, behavior, and coincidence collided. And as the courtroom filled and cameras rolled, one thing became clear. this case would not be decided by a single piece of evidence. It would unfold step by step, just like the staircase itself. As the investigation deepened, the staircase case shifted from a single night of tragedy to a meticulous dissection of a marriage, a crime scene, and a man's history. Prosecutors understood early that they did not have a traditional murder weapon or eyewitness. What they had instead was complexity. And they intended to turn that complexity into a narrative of intent. The blood evidence remained central. Forensic analysts examined the stairwell inch by inch. Blood was found not just on the steps, but on the walls, the door frame, and high above the floor. Some of it appeared dried, some smeared, some transferred. The prosecution's experts argued that the patterns were consistent with multiple impacts, not a single fall. They suggested Kathleen had been beaten, possibly with an object that left no obvious fractures. But the defense countered with equal confidence. They argued that scalp lacerations bleed profusely, far more than people expect, that a fall down a narrow staircase could cause repeated head strikes, that the absence of skull fractures mattered. That blood spatter interpretation was not an exact science, especially in a confined space where movement and attempts at aid could alter patterns. The same evidence told two stories, and neither could fully silence the other. Investigators also scrutinized the timeline. Michael Peterson's account placed him outside by the pool for an extended period while Kathleen went inside alone. Prosecutors questioned this. They suggested he was closer than he admitted, that he had time and opportunity, that his version of events was designed to distance himself from the moment of injury. Phone records, computer use, and witness statements were examined. Nothing definitively contradicted his timeline, but nothing conclusively supported it either. Then the case took a darker turn. Prosecutors introduced Michael Peterson's personal life. They alleged that Kathleen had recently discovered his secret sexual relationships with men. They argued that this revelation threatened his public image, his marriage, and his financial stability. According to the state, an argument escalated into violence. The defense rejected this entirely. They argued there was no proof Kathleen knew, no evidence of confrontation, no witness to an argument. They portrayed the prosecution's theory as moral judgment disguised as motive, an attempt to sway a jury by suggesting betrayal rather than proving homicide. Still, the narrative was powerful. Jurors were shown emails and online communications. They were told about secrecy and deception. The state framed Michael Peterson as a man with something to lose, someone capable of violence when that life was threatened. Whether that framing was fair or prejudicial became one of the most contested aspects of the trial. And then came Elizabeth Ratliff. Her death, long considered closed, was reopened in the court of public opinion. Prosecutors presented it as strikingly similar. A woman found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Michael Peterson present. The state argued that this was not coincidence, but a pattern repeating itself. The defense called it character assassination. They pointed out that Ratliff's death had been ruled natural by authorities in Germany, that no charges had ever been filed, that revisiting it decades later violated basic fairness. They argued that similarity did not equal guilt, and that staircases existed in countless homes. But the image lingered. 2 staircases, 2 deaths, 1 man. As the trial unfolded, expert witnesses became the battleground. Forensic pathologists disagreed publicly. Blood spatter analysts contradicted one another. Each side presented credentials, studies, reconstructions. Jurors were asked to choose not just between guilt and innocence, but between competing versions of science itself. Outside the courtroom, Media attention intensified. Cameras followed every entrance and exit. The case became a spectacle, not because of sensational violence, but because of its ambiguity. People argued over it in living rooms and online forums. Accident or murder, victim or villain. There was no consensus. Inside the courtroom, Michael Peterson remained composed. He took the stand in his own defense. He denied killing Kathleen. He denied arguing with her that night. He denied any intent to harm. His testimony was measured, articulate, and unwavering. To some, it sounded honest. To others, rehearsed. The jury watched closely. They were not just weighing evidence. They were assessing a man, his tone, his demeanor, his consistency. In a case built largely on interpretation, perception mattered. When closing arguments approached, both sides knew the risks. The prosecution asked jurors to trust the blood, to trust the pattern, to trust that coincidence had limits. The defense asked them to trust reasonable doubt, to trust that science could not say for certain what happened, to trust that tragedy did not always require a villain. The question looming over the courtroom was no longer about what was possible. It was about what could be proven. And as the jury prepared to deliberate, the staircase waited silently, holding its secrets unchanged by the arguments built around it. The verdict came down, but it did not bring clarity. It brought fracture. Michael Peterson was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the courtroom, reactions split sharply. Some saw justice. Others saw uncertainty hardened into punishment. Outside, debate only intensified. The staircase case did not settle. It deepened. From prison, Peterson maintained his innocence. Appeals followed. Motions were filed. And slowly, cracks appeared in the foundation of the conviction. Not in the narrative itself, but in the machinery that had helped construct it. At the center of that shift was forensic testimony. One of the prosecution's key expert witnesses was a bloodstain pattern analyst whose conclusions had carried enormous weight with the jury. He had testified that the blood evidence pointed to a beating, not a fall. That opinion had helped bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. Years later, his credibility unraveled. It emerged that the analyst had misrepresented his qualifications in multiple cases. Courts began reviewing his prior testimony. Convictions he had helped secure were questioned. In the Peterson case, this revelation changed everything. If the science was flawed, then the certainty built on it could not stand. A new hearing was granted. Evidence was re-examined. The same staircase. The same photographs. The same blood. But now the confidence once projected by expert testimony was replaced by restraint. What had been framed as definitive now appeared interpretive. Meanwhile, another theory began circulating, one that investigators had dismissed early and largely ignored at trial: the owl theory. It sounded improbable at first, almost absurd, but it was rooted in documented biology. In rare cases, barred owls had attacked humans, causing deep scalp lacerations with talons. The injuries Kathleen sustained were consistent in shape with claw marks. Small feathers and plant material were found near her body. Blood outside the house suggested an initial injury before she entered. The defense did not claim certainty. They claimed possibility, and possibility mattered. If an owl had attacked Kathleen outside, causing severe bleeding and disorientation, she could have entered the house confused, attempted to climb the stairs, and fallen. In that scenario, the blood, the injuries, and the absence of fractures could coexist without a beating. The prosecution dismissed the theory as desperate, but they could not fully disprove it. And that was the problem. The case was built on eliminating alternatives. The owl theory reintroduced one that could not be conclusively ruled out. As legal proceedings continued, the case shifted again, not toward exoneration, but toward compromise. Michael Peterson was granted a new trial. Facing the prospect of another courtroom battle, another jury, and more years of uncertainty, he made a decision that reflected the ambiguity at the heart of the case. He entered an Alford plea. Under this plea, Peterson maintained his innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution had enough evidence to potentially convict him again. He was released from prison, having already served years. There was no admission of guilt, no declaration of innocence, just an end to the legal process. For many, this felt unsatisfying. Victims, advocates wanted certainty. Kathleen Peterson's family wanted answers. Supporters of Michael Peterson wanted vindication. Instead, they received closure without resolution. The staircase remained what it had always been, a place where two stories collided. One story says Kathleen Peterson was murdered by her husband in a moment of violence fueled by secrecy and fear of exposure. The other says she died in a tragic, bizarre accident, shaped by chance, biology, and a fall that turned fatal. The justice system could not choose definitively between them. What the case ultimately exposed was not just a question of guilt, but the limits of certainty. It showed how heavily trials can depend on expert interpretation, how narratives can harden around incomplete science, and how once a story takes hold, it can be difficult to unwind. Michael Peterson walked free, but not absolved. Kathleen Peterson remained dead, her final moments still disputed. And the staircase, stripped of its legal significance, continued to stand quietly inside a house that no longer belonged to either of them. The investigation had ended. The debate had not. The staircase case never offered the kind of ending people expect from a murder investigation. There was no confession, no definitive reconstruction, no single piece of evidence that silenced every alternative. Instead, it ended the way it began, with uncertainty. Kathleen Peterson died at the bottom of a staircase in her own home. The physical evidence was disturbing but inconclusive. The blood was extensive. The injuries were severe. Yet the absence of skull fractures, the conflicting expert interpretations, and the lack of a clear weapon left room for more than one explanation. Michael Peterson was convicted, then later granted a new trial when critical forensic testimony was discredited. Faced with the prospect of reliving the case in court, he entered an Alford plea. He was released while maintaining his innocence. The legal system closed the case without declaring the truth. What remains is a collision of narratives. One portrays a hidden life, a confrontation, and a violent act disguised as an accident. The other sees a tragic chain of events, possibly involving an external injury and a fatal fall, misread through the lens of suspicion and flawed science. Both stories rely on interpretation. Neither can fully eliminate the other. The staircase endures because it exposes the fragile line between certainty and doubt. It shows how juries are asked to decide not just what happened, but which experts to trust. It reveals how easily coincidence can resemble pattern, and how hard it is to undo a story once it has been told. For Kathleen Peterson, there is no ambiguity. She lost her life. For Michael Peterson, there is no clean resolution. He is neither fully condemned nor fully cleared. And for everyone who examines the case, the staircase remains a symbol, not of guilt or innocence, but of the uncomfortable reality that sometimes, even after years of investigation, the truth remains just out of reach. Thank you for listening, and good night.